My name is Emily, and I'm a senior UX researcher on Google Assistant. What that means is I work with users, primarily kids and families, to understand how we can make Assistant even better for them. There are a lot of ways that I conduct research in my job, but I'm primarily a qualitative research, which means I do a lot of interviews. I do a lot of talking in depth with kids, parents, families of all kinds. Sometimes I'm in their home observing their lives and how technology actually fits into their space, and sometimes we're having conversations in one-on-one interviews in person. I work with designers in a lot of different ways. There are formal ways that we work together through meetings and, team efforts. We do a lot of design sprints, but I also like to work with designers in informal ways, just chatting in the hallway or coming to each other with ideas for things that I've heard in research that I'd love to build out, or designs that they're creating that they want to get a family perspective on. I think the power of user research has come through most clearly to me when I kept trying to tell my engineers about kids' developmental levels. I'd say, we need to change this feature because kids can't always read. And I kept pushing on this, but the engineers just didn't see that. They didn't quite understand it because we were operating from two different knowledge bases with two different goals. So I invited them to research, and I put our app in front of a 7-year-old girl. And as she's going through the app, you can see her frustration. And I said, "What would you do next on this screen?" She said, "I don't know." And I kept pushing, and she kept saying, "I don't know," till finally she said, "I can't read." All of the engineers in the back room had a new appreciation for research, for our users, and really learned to empathize with our user through research. Let's shift gears and talk about user experience research. Because I'm a UX researcher, I'm particularly looking forward to this section. Coming up, we're going to talk about how user experience research fits into the development of a product, common types of UX research methods and their benefits and drawbacks, and biases in UX research. As we get started, it's important to keep in mind that the role of a UX designer can look very different at different companies. At a larger company like Google with thousands of employees, UX designers often have a dedicated user experience research partner, so designers don't have to do much research themselves. But at a smaller company, one UX designer might be responsible for both the UX research and the UX design. That's why it's so critical for you to learn how to do both parts of the job. Plus, having some research skills can be really enticing to companies that are eager to hire new UX designers. Let's start with the basics. UX research focuses on understanding user behaviors, needs, and motivation through observation and feedback. The goal of user experience research is to prioritize the user. We also want to make sure business needs are met. UX research can help bridge the gap between what a business thinks the user needs and what the user actually needs before an expensive and time-consuming product is made. So how does UX research fit into the development of a product? To answer this question, we need to zoom out and revisit the product development lifecycle. You may remember that the product development lifecycle is the process used to take a product from an idea to reality. User research is a continuous part of the product development lifecycle and takes place before, during, and after Phase 3, design. Research that takes place before anything is designed is usually called foundational research. Some UX teams might also call it strategic or generative research. All three terms mean the same thing, but in this course, we'll stick with foundational research. Foundational research answers the question, what should we build? Additional questions you might ask during this research phase are, what are the user problems? How can we solve them? The goal of foundational research is to help define the problem you would like to design a solution for. This research includes talking with users and identifying their pain points when using a product. And guess what? Sometimes foundational research reveals opportunities no one on the design team would have come up with. Research that takes place during the design phase, Phase 3, of the product development lifecycle is called design research. Some teams call it tactical research, but both terms refer to the same thing. Design research answers the question, how should we build it? Here's a list of things you might want to ask users about during this phase of research. How was your experience using the prototype today? How easy or difficult was it to use? Why? Did you encounter any challenges? The goal of design research is to inform how the product should be built. Design research gives designers a chance to reduce the problems that occur as users interact with your prototype. You can conduct design research very early in the design process when you have paper sketches, or you can wait until you have a prototype to test with users. It just depends on what your key research goals are. The third type of user research is called post-launch research. You might guess that post-launch research only happens at the end of the product development lifecycle. Post-launch research can be used to evaluate how well a launched feature is meeting the needs of users. Post-launch research answers the question, did we succeed? The goal of post-launch research is to understand how users experienced the product and whether it was a good or poor user experience. You might also want to check your product's performance against the competition. Next, let's discuss some of the key qualities that UX researchers usually possess. Qualities of a good UX researcher include empathy, pragmatism, and collaboration. Empathy is the ability to understand someone else's feelings or thoughts in a situation. Pragmatism is a practical approach to problem solving. Pragmatic people are focused on reaching goals. Collaboration is the ability to work with a range of people, personalities, and work styles. You already have all of these qualities. All you need to do is learn how to apply them in your work. The more you develop these qualities, the more capable a researcher you can become over time. So keep at it. If you want to specialize as a UX researcher, you'll need some additional training. While our program focuses on UX design, keep in mind that research is always a part of the design process. Next, we'll discuss the types of research methods used for different research questions.
Hi, I'm Christy. I'm a UX designer at Google. I work on the services team at Google. Our mission is to connect customers and service providers together. So a service provider could be anyone like a yoga instructor or a plumber or a lawyer. So one of the main features that I design is the request a quote feature that you can see on both search and on Google Maps. So basically helping customers be able to request a quote directly from the business profile of a provider. My favorite job is working with the people there, the collaboration, the brainstorming that happens between designers and also with the engineers and product managers that are on our team. That really helps kind of build a stronger product when there's multiple opinions and different perspectives that come into play. So our process kind of starts differently depending on what feature we're working on, but a lot of times it starts with research and figuring out what needs are not being met for customers or, in my case, providers. So a lot of times we kind of do a lot of interviews and surveys to figure out what are people frustrated about, what are they not really happy with in their user journey. And then us designers kind of look into it and see what features or ideas that can help them, feel like this journey isn't too difficult or too hard. When I'm designing and I want to start getting feedback, I can bring it to critiques that happen within our design team. It's a very open space and safe space, and it's a very productive area where we can really try to push each other to think differently. And afterwards, often I would bring my designs to my product manager, kind of show him what directions that I'm thinking, and usually soon after, I'm also bringing it to engineers who are giving me feedback whether or not it's technically feasible as well. Feedback is super important because I often find myself really tunnel visioning on what I think the best design would be. And usually that's not going to be the best design. I get so passionate about an idea, but in the end, I need other people to tell me, hey, have you thought about this? And push me to think differently. One time I was learning to design for people who are colorblind. There's a lot of colors out there that actually, someone who is colorblind can't really differentiate. So if I didn't take that feedback, I think that app that I was designing for probably wouldn't be as helpful for those who were colorblind. So I'm glad I was able to listen and see and learn. You might hear a lot, but my advice is to stay open-minded and be willing to listen to other people's opinions about your design. I think it's really easy for us to hold it too close to our own hearts. And in the end, who you're designing for is not yourself. And so I think that's why it's so important to listen.
Hi again. Now that you know what's involved in user research, let's talk about user research methods. The term methods refers to how you get the research done. There are many different ways to get the answers we need from users, and you'll decide which research method to use based on the questions you need answered. Each method has positives and negatives, which we'll cover in another video. Before we jump into each research method, let's cover the basics. There are two ways we categorize research methods. The first way is based on who conducts the research. The second way is based on the type of data collected. So first, let's think about who conducts the research. Primary research is research you conduct yourself. For example, you might interview users, survey users, or conduct a usability study to hear from users directly. Secondary research is research that uses information someone else has put together. Secondary research can be information from books, articles, or journals. You've probably done secondary research before and not even realized it. Did you know looking up the statistics of a sports team counts as secondary research? Most of the time, secondary research is done at the very beginning of the product development lifecycle, before any ideation happens. Secondary research is often done by product leads, not UX designers. But the insights they share can help you make a stronger case for your design choices and gain more empathy for your users. Another way to categorize research methods is to think about the type of data collected. Data can be collected through qualitative or quantitative research. Quantitative research focuses on data that can be gathered by counting or measuring. Quantitative research is often based on surveys of large groups of people using numerical answers. This type of research often answers questions like how many and how much. If you want to know how the majority of users are experiencing a product, you should use quantitative research. On the other hand, qualitative research focuses on observations. Qualitative research is often based on interviews, where we focus on a smaller number of users and understand their needs in greater detail. This type of research answers questions like why or how did this happen? If you want to know why users are having a bad experience with your product and how to improve it, you should use qualitative research. Here's a quick way to remember the difference. Quantitative research gives you the what, and qualitative research gives you the why. So now that you know the basics of how we categorize research, it's time to dive into some common research methods. Let's start with interviews. Interviews are a research method used to collect in-depth information on people's opinions, thoughts, experiences, and feelings. Interviews are usually conducted in person and include a series of open-ended questions where the researcher asks the user about their experience. Use interviews when your questions require a detailed response. For example, can you spot the difference between these two questions? How would you rate your experience using the app on a scale of 1 to 10? Versus, how was your experience using the app? The second question is open-ended and allows the user to share more about their experience. Next up, surveys. Surveys are an activity where many people are asked the same questions in order to understand what most people think about a product. Surveys allow us to hear from a larger number of users than we can during interviews. Surveys include a mix of quantitative and qualitative questions. Surveys are most useful after you have some initial understanding of the user's pain points and want to solidify that by surveying a larger number of people. Finally, let's talk about usability studies. Usability studies are a technique that help us evaluate a product by testing it on users. The goal of a usability study is to identify pain points that the user experiences with different prototypes, so the issues can be fixed before the final product launches. During a usability study, you get a chance to see how your end users interact with your new product or feature, and afterwards you can interview the users to learn more about their experience. The usability study data is then used to improve the UX of the design. If the product has already launched, a post-launch usability study might include data like success metrics and key performance indicators, which are commonly known as KPIs. Key performance indicators are critical measures of progress toward an end goal. The KPIs for an app or new product launch might include things like how much time the user spent on a task or the number of clicks they used to make a purchase. You'll learn how to conduct your own usability studies soon. Now that you know all the research methods, you might be wondering how you can possibly pick one. The key thing to remember is that the research method we choose is decided by the question we are trying to answer. As you start working on a specific project, you'll be able to define the questions that will lead you to the best method. Next up, we'll check out the advantages and disadvantages of the methods we just introduced: interviews, surveys, and usability studies. Hi again. So, now you've been introduced to research methods that are commonly used in the field of UX. With lots of different methods to choose from, it can be tricky to know which method to use. We've got you covered. Coming up, we'll go over the benefits and drawbacks of research methods like secondary research, interviews, surveys, and usability studies. We'll also discuss why you'd choose one method over another. Remember what we mentioned earlier? The research method we choose depends on the question we're trying to answer. If we're just getting started with a project, we might use secondary research to know the stats, facts, and figures that already exist about our users. For example, imagine you're designing a budgeting app. You might want to review historical spending trends of folks in their 20s. Or you may want to learn what these young adults actually spend their money on. Chances are a credible study on this already exists. Finding one can save your team time and money. Plus, why redo work that's already been done? Another cool thing about secondary research is that it's immediately accessible. Usually, all you need is a good internet connection. Last, secondary research can be used to back up your own primary research. If users mention something during interviews, you might want to find secondary research to back it up. But there are also drawbacks to secondary research. Secondary research doesn't allow you to observe users interacting with your budgeting app, so you will not have feedback on how users feel about your product. Next, let's talk about interviews. Interviews allow you to understand what users think and why. During interviews, there is also an opportunity to ask follow-up questions and really understand the user's experience. The main drawback is that interviews take a lot of time and money. This means you'll end up with a small sample size, which can be risky when launching a brand new product. A compromise is surveys. As we learned earlier, surveys allow us to get feedback from a larger sample size of users. Other benefits of surveys are they are fast and inexpensive. You can hear perspectives from a lot of users very quickly. One big drawback to using surveys is that feedback from users is limited. Survey questions don't allow for in-depth feedback. Last but not least, let's think about usability studies. Usability studies allow us to observe firsthand user interaction with our product. Our designs make sense to us because we're the ones who created them, but that doesn't guarantee they'll make sense to every user. Usability studies keep our assumptions from getting in the way of acknowledging the user's actual experience. In addition, usability studies let the user give in-depth feedback. The drawback to usability studies is that they only measure one thing: how easy the product is to use. Another drawback to usability studies is that they are expensive because you have to bring users into a lab and reimburse them for their time. Finally, how a user interacts with your product in a lab environment is different than how they will actually use it in real life. All right, now you've got a basic understanding of the benefits and drawbacks of 4 common user research methods. Next, we'll shift gears and identify biases in UX research.
Hi there, my name's Craig, and I'm a research manager at Google. Thinking a little bit about my career path into UX, it was definitely not straightforward. I left university not sure what I wanted to do, not sure what UX was, bearing in mind this was 20 years ago when UX was really getting going. So my first job, I swept the floors in a gym. That was my first job. But I knew that I was interested in technology And I knew I had this research qualification, but I wasn't really sure what I needed to do or where I needed to go with that. Eventually, I managed to get a job in market research. So market research was like really buoyant at the time, plenty of jobs in market research. So I spent a couple of years working for a couple of different organizations, but it always seemed slightly removed from actually building products and actually using technology. A friend of mine made me aware that there was a junior position as a UX researcher in an online gaming company back in the UK. And I managed to get an interview. And I think that person, possibly feeling slightly sorry for me, decided that they were going to give me a go and give me a job. And since then, I haven't really looked back, but it did take somebody to believe in me that I had the skills necessary to be a great UXR to give me that opportunity. In terms of some of the things that really excite me about the job and the role, I like spending time on new stuff. Like, it's really amazing that within technology, you get a chance to just explore and play with stuff that maybe doesn't even exist yet. And you're trying to think about how you can combine research and insights into that product development process. And you'll work with tons and plenty of other people on that. That's the bit that I still get excited about. It's still the thing that, on a Monday morning where maybe the weather isn't great and you've got to get up early and you've had a great weekend, I'm just as excited about getting in and doing that kind of stuff, because that's what made me get into this business in the first place.
Hi again. Now that you know the basics of user research, let's explore how bias can get in the way. In this video, we're going to discuss how bias specifically affects design work. We'll examine 6 kinds of biases: confirmation bias, false consensus bias, primacy bias, recency bias, implicit bias, and the sunk cost fallacy. To begin, let's define the word bias. In short, a bias is favoring or having prejudice against something based on limited information. It's like making up your mind about someone before you've really gotten to know them. We all have biases, and they're often unconscious. While we can't completely get rid of biases, we can be more aware of them and work to overcome them. In UX design, this is critical to product success and to your professional development. Everything we've learned so far has shown us that we aren't the user. We've also learned how important it is to put ourselves in our user's shoes when making design decisions. Biases can really get in the way of doing this. Later, we'll get into the details of how this all applies to your work. The first kind of bias to be aware of is confirmation bias. This bias occurs when you start looking for evidence to prove a hypothesis you have. Because you think you already have the answer, you're drawn to information that confirms your beliefs and preconceptions. Let's say you have the preconception that left-handed people are more creative than right-handed people. As you research, you'll tend to gravitate towards evidence that supports this belief, and you'll use it to build your case, even though it's not necessarily true. One of the most effective methods for overcoming confirmation bias during research is to ask open-ended questions when conducting interviews. An open-ended question lets the person being interviewed answer freely instead of with a yes or a no. You also want to get into the habit of actively listening without adding your own opinions. That means you aren't leading your interviewees towards the answer that you want them to give. Another way to avoid confirmation bias is to include a large sample of users. Make sure you're not just looking for a small group of people who fit your preconceived ideas. You want to have a big sample of users with diverse perspectives. Next up, let's look at the false consensus bias, which is the assumption that others will think the same way as you do. In UX research, the false consensus bias happens when we overestimate the number of people who will agree with our idea or design, which creates a false consensus. It's possible for the false consensus to go so far as to assume anyone who doesn't agree with you is abnormal. You can avoid false consensus bias by identifying and articulating your assumptions. For example, you might live in a community that often identifies with certain political beliefs. When you meet a new person, you might assume they share your political beliefs because you both live in the same town. But that isn't necessarily true. Finding a few people who do align with your beliefs and assuming they represent the entire community is a false consensus. That's another reason to survey large groups of people. Another kind of bias that affects designers is the recency bias. That's when it's easiest to remember the last thing you heard in an interview, conversation, or similar setting because it's the most recent. When talking to someone, you're more likely to remember things they shared at the end of the conversation. To overcome the recency bias, you can take detailed notes or recordings for each interview or conversation you have. This way, you can review what people said at the start of the conversation, in case you don't remember. UX designers might also struggle with primacy bias, where you remember the first participant most strongly. Sometimes, the first person you meet makes the strongest impression because you're in a new situation or having a new experience. The primacy bias, like the recency bias, is another reason to take detailed notes or recordings, so you can review everything that happened, not just the memorable first impressions. Recency and primacy biases also demonstrate why you should interview each participant in the same way. Consistency makes it easier to compare and contrast over time. And consistency makes it more likely that you'll remember the unusual and important moments that happen throughout your research. The next form of bias we'll cover is implicit bias, which is also known as unconscious bias. Implicit bias is a collection of attitudes and stereotypes we associate to people without our conscious knowledge. One of the most common forms of implicit bias in UX is when we only interview people within a limited set of identity profiles, such as race, age, gender, socioeconomic status, and ability. These profiles are generally based on assumptions we have about certain types of people. For example, implicit bias might cause you to feel uncomfortable interviewing people whose life experiences are different from your own. On the other hand, we might choose to interview people from typically excluded groups, but then ask potentially offensive questions because of our internalized stereotypes. Both of these scenarios are problematic and lead to a lack of representation in our research and design process. The most important thing to note about implicit biases is that everybody has them. To overcome our biases, we can reflect on our behaviors, and we can ask others to point out our implicit biases. That's one of the best ways we can become aware of our biases. The last form of bias we'll cover is the sunk cost fallacy. This is the idea that the deeper we get into a project we've invested in, the harder it is to change course without feeling like we failed or wasted time. The phrase sunk cost refers to the time we've already spent or sunk into a project or activity. For example, you might think to yourself, I might as well keep watching this terrible movie because I've watched an hour of it already. For UX designers, the sunk cost fallacy comes into play when working on a design. You might have invested hours into designing a new feature, but then learn that the feature doesn't really address a user problem. It's easy to keep working on a design that you've invested time into, but ultimately, you need to focus on work that positively impacts users. To avoid the sunk cost fallacy, break down your project into smaller phases and then outline designated points where you can decide whether to continue or stop. This allows you to go back based on new insights before the project gets too far along. You're now familiar with the most common forms of bias in user research. It's important to know that there are other biases we haven't covered here. Bias is a limitation that extends well beyond the fields of UX design and user research. They can creep into the ways we make friends, manage projects at work, and communicate with family members. Now that you know about these biases, you might even start noticing them in your daily life. The more that identifying bias becomes a habit, the better you'll get at avoiding bias in your design process. As UX designers, we want to prevent biases from getting in the way of accurate research. You can always refer back to the glossary if you need a refresher about these biases and their definitions. Keep these tips in mind for overcoming biases, and you'll be on your way.
Hi, my name is Dina. I'm a senior user experience researcher at Google. As a user experience researcher, I really channel the voice of people, their motivations, their desires, their needs. I bring those insights back to my team, which they use to help build new products or improve existing products. Let's talk about bias in user research. That can happen in many ways, in many shapes, in many forms. I'll give one example. In user research, we set out to interview people. What we may not realize is for every person we interview, we're probably excluding someone. And so as a researcher, it's really important to know why we choose to interview certain people over others and who we are excluding, and whether or not those we're excluding need to actually be interviewed. One of the products I work on is Google Food Ordering, where we help consumers be able to order food from businesses around them. But along the way, we realized we hadn't really spoken to the merchants since we weren't really directly integrating with them. We didn't speak to them and understand their needs. So we set out to actually do that. Once we uncovered that insight, it was a light bulb moment for us. And we realized we had a great opportunity to build an ecosystem that was going to be equitable for everyone. As a researcher, you uncover so many insights. We take those insights and we're constantly improving on the products that we build. So overall, that solution enabled us to realize that, we need to understand the bigger picture, the whole ecosystem. We need to include all voices when we're designing so that we build a solution that is equitable and fair for all the people who will be impacted as a result.
Hey there! Let's take a moment to review what you've learned recently. You started with the basics and understanding the role that UX research plays in the design process. Remember, the goal of user experience research is to prioritize the user. You also examined how UX research fits into the development of a product, including foundational research, design research, and post-launch research. Then, you were introduced to 2 ways to categorize research methods: primary and secondary research, and quantitative and qualitative research. As part of that conversation, you went through the benefits and drawbacks to popular research methods like secondary research, interviews, surveys, and usability studies. Finally, we talked about identifying and avoiding biases. You've come a long way. Keep up the good work.
Congratulations! You've completed the first course in the program. You worked incredibly hard, and it shows. You should be very proud of yourself. Back when you started this program, you might have been nervous or excited, or both. And you might have wondered what UX even meant. Now look at you. You now know what a UX designer does and what drives us to make products better for users. Plus, you already started building your portfolio and thinking about your career. Let's review your accomplishments. In this course, you discovered user experience and why it's important for users and businesses, and learned what makes a design good for the user. Identified different disciplines within UX and what sort of tasks you might do as a UX designer. Learn the common tools, frameworks, and platforms used in UX design. Identify the steps of a design sprint and how you, as an entry-level UX designer, can take part in that process. You've covered a lot. You have a solid foundation in user experience that you can add to throughout the rest of this program. We'll build on your knowledge in the next course, where we'll get started with user research, understanding design problems, and brainstorming early solutions. Emily, who you met briefly in the introduction to the program, will be your guide for the next course. Emily is a fantastic instructor and really knowledgeable about the field of UX, so get ready to learn a lot. Now it's time for me to sign off. It's been such a pleasure taking you through this course. I can't wait to experience your designs in action one day. Good luck as you continue the program.